migrants from China are now the fastest growing group of people entering the United States illegally from Mexico.
We're talking about the crisis on the border. Tens of thousands of migrants continuing to seek asylum right here in the U.S.
While many are from Latin America, a growing number of people are making the long trek from China to cross the border. From January through September of this year, Customs and Border Protection officials arrested more than 22,000 people from China illegally crossing into the United States. That's roughly 13 times more.
The migrants also risk getting robbed, extorted, and sexually abused by criminal groups that control the Darien Gap.
我在山上看见尸体，我看见他的用那个帐篷，就帐篷的布盖身上。
The family makes landfall, bearing bad news.
杜伟，我们全部抢光了，我们全部抢光了。
那个，爸爸，哎呦，人没事吧？没事啊。哎呦，吓到了是不是？妈妈吓到了。
我全部抢光了。
我们并且还搜身了，把衣服都脱光了，钱都抢了。什么人抢的？
起码是6批人在那里，每一个人带批人，然后你主动的把包全部翻掉，翻掉以后把衣服全部脱掉收。
This is not just another story about immigration. This is not a simple border crisis. What you are about to see and hear reveals a hidden war, one where human lives are reduced to merchandise, traded for cash and violence, and used to finance the darkest criminal empires in the Western Hemisphere. Thousands of men, women, and children from China are now being pulled into a deadly pipeline, dragged through jungles and deserts, only to be abandoned, abused, and sold as part of a billion-dollar enterprise. For the cartels of Mexico, these migrants are not human beings. They are products. They are assets. They are, quite literally, moving sacks of money that fund fentanyl labs, fuel corruption, and strengthen violent organizations that already control entire regions of Mexico. For the United States, they represent an unrelenting wave of desperation crashing against a broken immigration system. And for the migrants themselves, it is a gamble for survival, an escape from hopelessness at home into an abyss of new dangers abroad. In the past year alone, over 42,000 Chinese nationals have made this journey across Latin America to the U.S.-Mexico border. This is not a handful of isolated cases, nor small groups slipping unnoticed through gaps in the fence. This is a mass movement, a tidal surge flowing through what is known as the Gap, a notorious section of broken borderland wide open to cartel domination. Why now? Why in such numbers? The answer is as brutal as it is simple. Cartels discovered that Chinese migrants are a jackpot. Unlike Central American migrants, who may pay a few $1,000s, the Chinese are forced to pay between $14,000 and $70,000 per person. Fees that often must be prepaid, transferred directly into the pockets of snakeheads and cartel smugglers. Each person is worth more than gold, more than guns. Each body that crosses the border is a bundle of cash waiting to be laundered into fentanyl precursors, automatic rifles, or bribes to police and politicians. The cartels have perfected the system. They collaborate with so-called snakeheads, Chinese human smuggling networks with long histories of moving people across continents. Together, they have built a pipeline, a conveyor belt of human cargo stretching from airports in Asia to jungle trails in Central America, and finally to the deserts of northern Mexico. The migrants themselves rarely understand the danger until it is too late. They are told it is a journey like any other. They are told there are guides, routes, and steps they simply need to follow. Some even find instructions posted openly on social media apps, including TikTok, where videos circulate teaching step by step how to escape China, connect with a snakehead, and eventually present themselves at the American border. But behind this digital facade lies the reality of the Darien Gap, the deadliest jungle on Earth. Spanning 30,000 square kilometers between Colombia and Panama, it is a swamp of mud, rainforests, and mountains where no roads exist, where temperatures soar above 35 degrees Celsius, and where death waits at every corner. Flash floods swallow camps overnight, snakes and crocodiles patrol rivers, clouds of mosquitoes carry dengue and malaria. Bandits, narco-traffickers, and anti-government guerrillas control entire stretches of land. Migrants stumble, fall, and vanish into the mud. Others are robbed, raped, or murdered if they cannot pay. For the Chinese who survive this nightmare, there is little reprieve. Some who can afford it bypass the jungle entirely, flying directly into Mexico on tourist visas. But even then, their safety is an illusion. At the airport in Tijuana or Mexico City, cartel-linked smugglers are already waiting. These are not guides offering hospitality. They are predators. Migrants who hesitate to pay are abandoned. Families who cannot cough up the last few $100s for the final leg are left stranded. Women and children are at constant risk of sexual exploitation. Parents pay porters to carry toddlers across rivers, their children reduced to luggage in a system that sees them only as obstacles to profit. Why would anyone endure this? Why would anyone take such a path? The answer lies thousands of miles away, back in China, where a collapsing economy, suffocating government controls, and relentless repression push ordinary citizens to desperation. Factories that once employed millions have shuttered. Small businesses, especially during the brutal zero-COVID lockdowns, were crushed without mercy. For many, the future is gone. A 20-year-old graduate, unable to find work after his local factory closed, sells everything he owns. He hands $14,000 to smugglers, believing that in Los Angeles he might finally find a job. A 37-year-old mother, her childcare business destroyed by pandemic restrictions, sells her house. She leaves behind 2 young children in China, hoping that asylum in America will grant her a new beginning. Instead, she finds herself stuck in legal limbo, stranded in makeshift camps on U.S. soil, waiting months or years for her case to be heard. The scenes at the border are a study in contrasts. SUVs without license plates screech to a halt on dirt roads. Outspill groups of migrants, some clutching battered backpacks, others dragging shiny suitcases, as if they had mistakenly wandered off a tourist bus. They gather along the rusted fence, waiting for an opening, waiting to surrender to Border Patrol agents who, overwhelmed, can only process them in waves. On the private ranches that dot this borderland, chaos reigns. In Jacumba, California, a retired man named Jerry Schuster owns 17 acres of desert scrub. Overnight, his land has become a battlefield. Thousands of migrants cross through weekly, leaving behind trash, burnt trees, and makeshift shelters. Schuster, desperate to defend his property, once fired warning shots when a group of migrants tried to light a fire on his land. For this, he was arrested, his gun confiscated, and left to fend for himself unarmed. The government knows the gap exists. Border Patrol officers acknowledge the problem. Yet the fence remains unrepaired, the excuse being that funding must come from Congress. The cartels, of course, do not wait. They exploit the opening daily, funneling thousands through without pause. And once inside the United States, the system itself provides no deterrent. Chinese migrants are uniquely successful in asylum cases. More than half receive protection, compared to only 14% of other nationalities. Why? Because the U.S. government acknowledges that China's regime engages in widespread human rights abuses, making it easier for applicants to prove credible fear of persecution. Even those denied asylum often avoid deportation, since China frequently refuses to take back its own citizens. The cartels understand this better than anyone. They know that once Chinese migrants step onto American soil, their odds of staying are high. This knowledge drives more to attempt the journey, feeding a vicious cycle where desperation fuels demand and demand fuels cartel profits. But the story doesn't end at human smuggling. The money paid by Chinese migrants directly strengthens the cartel war machine. With each $35,000 fee collected, the cartels buy more weapons, bribe more officials, and finance more drug production. Bodies hang from bridges as messages to rivals. Entire towns are silenced by fear, and there is another layer: fentanyl. Mexican cartels, particularly Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation, partner with Chinese criminal networks to import the precursor chemicals needed to manufacture this deadly opioid. The same networks that smuggle people also smuggle chemical shipments. The fees collected from human cargo are recycled into fentanyl production, a drug that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. This is the deadly alliance: Chinese suppliers, Mexican cartels, American addicts, and the migrants caught in between. The human cost cannot be overstated. Each statistic is a person: a teacher selling her home, a young man risking his future, a family trudging through a swamp with their children strapped to their backs. They do not see themselves as commodities. They see themselves as survivors. But to the cartels, they are little more than pawns in a game of profit and power. For the United States, the impact is immediate and overwhelming. Border patrol stations are overcrowded, their resources stretched thin. Processing centers designed to handle hundreds of migrants now face thousands, day after day. In some towns, local officials complain that their hospitals and shelters are already overrun. Volunteers rush to provide food, blankets, and water. Yet despite their efforts, the flow never stops. Each week brings more buses, more families, more desperate souls crossing into the unknown. At the same time, the American legal system buckles under the weight of asylum claims. Judges are buried under backlogs that stretch for years. For migrants, this means long waiting periods, often spent in temporary housing or camps, suspended in legal uncertainty. For the cartels, it is the perfect loophole. Every successful asylum case confirms to would-be migrants in China that the journey is worth it. Every failed deportation case proves to the cartels that they can continue charging exorbitant fees with little risk of their product being sent back. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground grows more volatile. Residents of border towns describe waking up to strangers camping on their land, to bonfires in their fields, to garbage scattered across properties they have maintained for generations. What used to be a quiet rural life has become an uneasy coexistence with an international crisis. Some sympathize with the migrants, understanding their desperation. Others seethe with anger, demanding that the government do more to secure the border. The tension divides communities, breeding resentment and fear. The cartels, however, thrive in this chaos. To them, disorder is opportunity. By controlling the movement of people, they establish dominance over entire regions. They decide who crosses, who pays, and who is left behind. Migrants who resist or refuse to pay are beaten, robbed, or worse. Women are forced into prostitution. Children disappear. Human lives are commodities to be traded, leveraged, or discarded. And all the while, the profits pour in. The scale of these profits cannot be overstated. A single Chinese migrant paying $35,000 funds not just one smuggling operation, but an entire network. Multiply that by tens of thousands of migrants, and the numbers climb into the billions. These revenues do not simply vanish into luxury cars or private mansions. They are reinvested into the cartel infrastructure itself, into laboratories producing fentanyl, into armored vehicles patrolling the streets of Mexican cities, into bribes for law enforcement officers and politicians, into weapons capable of outgunning entire police forces. The United States government has accused Mexico of turning a blind eye to these operations. Corruption, intimidation, and weak institutions allow smugglers to move freely. Even when raids or arrests occur, the cartels adapt, shifting routes and rebranding their operations. In truth, the cartels have become shadow governments, more powerful in some regions than the official state itself. Their grip extends beyond Mexico into Central America, South America, and now, increasingly, into Asia through their partnerships with Chinese criminal organizations. The alliance is chilling. For decades, Chinese crime syndicates have operated quietly in Latin America, supplying the chemicals necessary to produce methamphetamine. Now, they stand at the upstream source of the fentanyl crisis that devastates American communities. The precursors flow from factories in China to ports in Mexico, where cartel chemists transform them into pills and powders. These drugs then flood across the U.S. border, fueling an epidemic that kills over 70,000 Americans every year. Human smuggling and drug trafficking are no longer separate industries. They are intertwined, each feeding the other. The fees from smuggling migrants bankroll drug operations. The drugs themselves finance further smuggling, creating a cycle of crime that spans continents. The cartels grow richer, the migrants grow more desperate, and the death toll rises. For the migrants, the nightmare does not end upon reaching American soil. Many arrive with no resources, no family, and no understanding of the legal system. They are easy targets for exploitation by employers who offer underpaid, dangerous jobs. Some are forced into labor trafficking, working long hours in kitchens, farms, or factories under threat of deportation. Others are pressured into the underground economy, indebted to smugglers who demand repayment even after arrival. Yet behind each of these grim stories lies a very human motivation. For many, leaving China is not simply a choice, it is survival. Under Xi Jinping's tightening grip, dissent is crushed, surveillance is everywhere. Economic opportunities have evaporated. Factories shut down, unemployment skyrockets, and small business owners see their life savings destroyed by arbitrary lockdowns and regulations. In such an environment, hope itself becomes a luxury. The United States, with its promise of freedom and opportunity, represents the last chance at a future. But hope collides with reality at the border. There, desperation meets exploitation. There, the dreams of a better life are tested against cartel brutality, jungle hazards, and bureaucratic inertia. Some succeed, gaining asylum and rebuilding their lives. Others vanish into limbo, stuck in shelters, unable to return home, yet unable to move forward. And too many never make it at all, their bodies left in rivers, jungles, or deserts, another anonymous casualty of a system that values profit over humanity. The scale of the tragedy demands recognition. This is not simply immigration. This is not just a border dispute. This is a war, an escalating conflict where cartels grow stronger by weaponizing human suffering, where governments falter under the weight of corruption and bureaucracy, and where ordinary people pay the ultimate price. If nothing changes, the cycle will continue. The economic pressures in China show no sign of easing. Xi Jinping's policies have only tightened, leaving millions without prospects. The cartels, emboldened by their immense profits, have no incentive to stop. On the contrary, they are expanding, finding new routes, new markets, new victims. The United States, trapped between political gridlock and overwhelmed institutions, remains unable to respond effectively. And so, the war grinds on. Each day, new migrants set out, clutching their few belongings, stepping into the abyss of the Darien Gap or boarding planes to Mexico. Each day, smugglers count their profits, drug labs hum with activity, and border communities struggle to hold the line. Each day, the human cost grows higher, measured not just in statistics, but in broken families, lost lives, and shattered dreams. This is the reality behind the headlines. This is the war we are losing, not with tanks and soldiers, but with cash, chemicals, and human bodies turned into bargaining chips. The imagery along the US-Mexico border is surreal. In some places, it resembles a scene out of a humanitarian crisis zone, with tents pitched on scrubland, fires burning in metal cans, and families huddling in blankets against the desert cold. In others, it appears almost absurd, as if a group of tourists with rolling suitcases had stumbled into a no-man's land, confused and exhausted, waiting for someone to tell them what comes next. But beneath these scenes lies the same constant reality: control by cartels. Nothing and no one crosses without their permission. Private property owners find themselves caught in the middle. Men like Jerry Schuster are left to live on what feels like a front line. His land near Jacumba, California, once a quiet place for retirement, has become a funnel point for thousands of migrants each week. He watches his trees chopped for firewood, his soil trampled, his land littered with clothes, bottles, and food scraps. When he tried to protect his property with a rifle, the law came down not on the trespassers, but on him. His weapon was confiscated. He was treated not as a victim, but as a criminal. For Schuster and others, the message is clear: they are on their own. At the federal level, politicians argue endlessly over budgets, walls, and asylum reform. Border Patrol agents in the field know exactly where the weak points are, but fixing them requires congressional approval, funding allocations, and political will, three things perpetually missing. Meanwhile, the cartels adapt faster than any government can react. If one route is blocked, they open another. If a wall is reinforced, they exploit tunnels or rivers. If surveillance increases in one sector, they shift their human cargo to another. The cartels thrive on flexibility. Bureaucracies do not. For the migrants, the gap is both literal and symbolic. It is the stretch of broken fence where they physically enter the United States, but it also represents the vast gap between promises and reality, between law and enforcement, between hope and despair. Each crossing underscores the fragility of U.S. border security and the cunning of those who exploit it. And once inside the United States, the migrants encounter a second, more subtle battlefield: the immigration court system. Here, outcomes are decided not by survival in the jungle, but by legal arguments and paperwork. Chinese migrants enjoy a statistical advantage, with asylum grants far exceeding those of other nationalities. The reason is rooted in America's recognition of human rights abuses in China: arbitrary detention, censorship, religious persecution, surveillance, and the crushing of dissent. For judges, these claims often meet the legal threshold of credible fear. For cartels, this knowledge is a selling point, an advertisement to future clients. "Pay us," the snakeheads tell desperate Chinese families, "and once you get to America, you will stay." The reality is more complicated. Many do secure asylum, but many others do not, left in limbo for years while their cases crawl through an overburdened court system. Deportations to China are inconsistent, as Beijing often drags its feet or outright refuses to take its citizens back. For those who cannot be deported, release into American communities becomes the default outcome. This fuels political backlash, polarizing debates over border security, and leaving communities to cope with the consequences. Meanwhile, The cartels are already counting the next wave of profits. A single successful smuggling operation reinforces the model. Families back in China see that their relatives have made it, that they are still in America, and that inspires more to attempt the journey. For the cartels, this is exponential growth, a pipeline of human cargo that not only sustains itself, but expands automatically, fueled by desperation abroad and dysfunction at home. And all of it, the tens of millions flowing from human smuggling, feeds directly into the cartel's broader empire. The Sinaloa cartel, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and others use these funds to consolidate power. With this money, they manufacture more fentanyl, buy more military-grade weapons, and corrupt more officials. The link between Chinese migration and America's opioid epidemic is not incidental. It is symbiotic. The same Chinese criminal networks that organize migrant smuggling also ship fentanyl precursors. The same cartel organizations that charge $30,000 per migrant also oversee labs producing the synthetic opioids flooding American cities. This is why experts describe the situation as not merely a migration crisis, but a form of hybrid warfare. Cartels have weaponized human movement. They profit from the suffering of Chinese families while simultaneously destabilizing American communities with drugs. They turn the gaps in the immigration system into a conveyor belt of cash and power. And through corruption and violence, they ensure that no government, not even Mexico's, can easily disrupt them. The humanitarian cost is staggering. Behind the statistics are stories of unimaginable suffering. A middle-class teacher in Guangzhou who sells her home to finance the journey, only to find herself stranded in a jungle where armed men demand her last possessions. A young man in his 20s who dreams of working in a restaurant in Los Angeles, but instead is extorted, beaten, and abandoned in Panama. A mother separated from her children for years while waiting for her asylum hearing. These stories rarely make headlines, yet they are the human faces of a global tragedy. Even for those who succeed, survival in the United States is not simple. Without English, without legal status, without support networks, many fall into the shadows. They take jobs in underground economies, working long hours in kitchens, warehouses, or sweatshops, often under conditions that border on slavery. Others become trapped in cycles of debt bondage, forced to repay smugglers or loan sharks who finance their journey. Their vulnerability is permanent. Their exploitation does not end at the border. It merely changes form. The cartels exploit this vulnerability too. For some migrants, debts to smugglers follow them into the United States. They are pressured to work for cartel-affiliated businesses, to launder money, to transport drugs, or to facilitate further smuggling. What began as a desperate attempt to find safety becomes a lifelong entanglement with organized crime. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical context cannot be ignored. U.S. officials accuse China of stonewalling deportations, a tactic that leaves thousands of migrants in American custody or on American soil indefinitely. Beijing, for its part, denies the accusations, claiming it is willing to cooperate if proper procedures are followed. Yet the stalemate continues, and the backlog grows. The migrants themselves often stand out in the border camps, cleaner clothes, neater luggage, sometimes even carrying electronics. They look different from the Central American families who arrive with little more than the clothes on their backs. This difference has not gone unnoticed. To some, it highlights the economic desperation of China's struggling middle class, a demographic willing to trade everything for a chance at opportunity abroad. To others, it fuels conspiracy theories, whispers that this wave of migration is not spontaneous, but coordinated, perhaps even strategic. Regardless of the speculation, the facts remain. The cartels are richer than ever. The USPC border remains porous, and thousands of Chinese citizens continue to risk their lives on a path paved with violence and exploitation. This is the new face of global migration, one shaped not by policy or diplomacy, but by the ruthless logic of organized crime. And yet, despite the darkness, the story is not without glimmers of humanity. Volunteers, activists, and community groups along the border do what they can to provide aid. They bring food, water, and medical supplies. They advocate for reform and call attention to the suffering. But they are outnumbered, underfunded, and often ignored by the very governments that should be addressing the crisis. Each day the cycle repeats. Migrants depart from China. Snakeheads guide them through airports or jungles. Cartels escort them across rivers and deserts. Border Patrol processes them. Courts delay their cases, and communities absorb the impact. Meanwhile, fentanyl overdoses claim more lives, cartel violence spreads, and the profits keep rolling in. This is not a temporary surge. It is not a short-term phenomenon. It is the new normal, a grim reality that intertwines international crime, migration, drugs, and human suffering into one seamless system. And unless something changes, the war will continue to escalate. What makes this crisis particularly insidious is that it unfolds largely in the shadows, hidden from public attention, except in brief bursts of sensational headlines. The suffering of Chinese migrants rarely makes front-page news. The cartel violence that accompanies their journey is often overshadowed by broader debates about immigration policy. Yet together, these threads weave into a tapestry of global significance. Consider the scale. Over 42,000 Chinese nationals in a single year, funneled through the same deadly passageways long used for drug trafficking, each one paying fees ranging from $14,000 to $70,000. Multiply the math, and the revenues dwarf even some segments of the narcotics trade. For cartels, smuggling humans has become as profitable as smuggling cocaine, without the risk of losing the product to overdoses or seizures. Unlike drugs, human beings walk themselves across the border. The strategic implications cannot be ignored. Cartels are no longer just criminal groups. They are paramilitary organizations, holding sway over entire territories, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and building transnational alliances. Their partnership with Chinese networks for fentanyl production is only one example. Their exploitation of Chinese migrants is another. Together, these operations form an economy of crime that spans continents, undermines governments, and destabilizes societies. Meanwhile, American policymakers remain locked in partisan stalemate. One side calls for more walls, more agents, and harsher enforcement. The other emphasizes humanitarian obligations, asylum rights, and reform. In the crossfire, the migrants themselves become political pawns, faces on campaign ads, talking points in debates, statistics in congressional hearings. Yet the root problem remains unaddressed: the cartel's stranglehold on the border and the broken systems that allow them to profit. Mexico, too, finds itself at a crossroads. Officially, its government condemns cartel violence and pledges cooperation with the United States. In practice, corruption and fear often paralyze local institutions. Police forces are outgunned. Politicians are bought or threatened. Entire communities live under the cartel's shadow. For Mexico, the crisis is existential: reclaim sovereignty or cede it permanently to criminal empires. Back in China, the pressures that fuel migration show no signs of easing. Xi Jinping's administration continues its campaign of centralization and control. Economic growth has slowed, youth unemployment has soared, and small businesses struggle under arbitrary regulations. For many Chinese citizens, The dream of prosperity has collapsed. Emigration is not a choice, but an escape, a desperate leap toward survival. And so long as desperation persists, the cartels will have clients. The humanitarian consequences ripple outward. For every migrant who makes it to the United States, there are families left behind in China, children separated from parents, elderly relatives abandoned without caretakers, communities hollowed by departures. For every migrant who perishes in the jungle, there are survivors who carry the trauma for life. For every dollar paid to a smuggler, there is a reinforcement of the criminal infrastructure that perpetuates violence from Colombia to California. Even within the United States, the aftershocks spread. Border towns face daily surges that overwhelm resources. Cities across the country receive migrants who arrive with little support, creating challenges in housing, healthcare, and employment. Political tensions sharpen, with some citizens calling for compassion and others demanding crackdowns. The national conversation grows more polarized, more angry, more divided. Yet the cartels remain indifferent. For them, division is strength. Every delay in reform, every argument in Congress, every local protest buys them more time to operate. They thrive in chaos. They expand in the gaps between law and enforcement, between nations and policies, between ideals and reality. This is why experts describe the situation as a war, not a traditional war fought with tanks and planes, but a war of attrition fought with people, drugs, and money. The cartels are the generals, the migrants are the soldiers, unwilling, unarmed, and expendable. The battleground is the border, but the consequences stretch far beyond. In this war, victory will not come from walls alone, nor will it come from humanitarian aid alone. It requires dismantling the cartel business model, cutting off their profits, disrupting their alliances, and addressing the root causes of migration. It requires cooperation between nations, not blame shifting. It requires recognition that human lives are not commodities, that desperation should not be currency, and that no society can thrive while its borders are auctioned to criminals. But as of now, none of that is happening. The cartels continue to grow, the migrants continue to come, the deaths continue to mount, and the governments on both sides of the border continue to argue. The question that lingers is not whether the situation is sustainable, it is how much worse it will get before something changes. Will the United States finally confront the cartels with the full force of its power? Will Mexico take back control of its territories? Will China take responsibility for the desperation driving its citizens into the hands of criminals? Or will the cycle spin on, endlessly, a grim carousel of suffering and profit? In the end, the story is not about statistics, or policies, or profits. It is about people. About the 20-year-old who sells everything to chase a dream, only to collapse in a jungle swamp. About the mother who leaves her children behind, only to find herself stranded in legal limbo. About the families who risk everything, not knowing if they will live to see the other side. The war is not slowing, it is escalating. Each new migrant is another payment to the cartels. Each new crossing is another reminder of the system's fragility. Each new overdose in the United States is another consequence of the alliance between Mexican cartels and Chinese networks. This is not just a crisis. It is a war without borders, fought with money and lives, waged across continents, and fueled by desperation. And so, we are left with a choice. Will we continue to ignore the suffering, allowing cartels to grow richer and more powerful? Or will we finally confront the reality that the border crisis is not simply about migration, but about global crime, corruption, and the commodification of human beings? The story is not over. It is being written every day, in the jungles of Panama, in the deserts of Mexico, in the courtrooms of America, and in the homes of families left behind in China. Each chapter is darker than the last. Each page is stained with blood, sweat, and tears. And unless something changes, the ending will be written not by governments or laws, but by the cartels themselves. This war is escalating. It will not stop on its own. And the longer we wait, the higher the cost in lives, in communities, and in futures lost. If you have watched this far, you now know the truth. You know what is happening in the jungles, in the deserts, and at the border. You know who profits and who pays. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? The fight against the cartels, against the commodification of human beings, and against the global machinery of exploitation requires more than awareness. It requires action. It requires courage. It requires the will to confront a war that is already at our doorstep. This is not just a crisis. This is war, and unless we act, it will consume us all. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Together, we can shine a light on what the cartels want to keep in the shadows. Together, we can refuse to look away.